to be human is to be strung out across, two sides of a belly. The way in which the gastrointestinal tract is where the outside world whistles in, how the outside world gets in to the kind of inner sanctum of the body. There's also something deeply ontologically shuddering about eating, right? Because eating is, in a really basic way, how we go about transforming the outer world into the inner world.
Welcome to CC, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Sassy here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Sassy. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to CC, the podcast where you see what others see. In this season, we're talking about guts. And today, we'll talk about the history of the gut, uncleanness, identity, and dreams. And guess with whom we'll be talking?
Our guest today is Dr. Elsa Richardson, distinguished historian, academic, and acclaimed author, whose groundbreaking research has reshaped our understanding of cultural history. Dr. Richardson holds a Chancellor's Fellowship in the History of Health and Wellbeing at the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare at the University of Strathclyde, specialised in the intersection between the medical and cultural history. Her studies consider the relation of heterodox practices, beliefs and movements to mainstream society and culture, with a particular focus on the interaction between medicine and the imagination, science and the supernatural, psychology and the occult. A Financial Times most anticipated read for 2024, Dr. Richardson's insightful book, Rumbles, A Curious History of the Gut, is a cultural history not just of the gut, an organ that refuses to be civilised, but also of how it makes us behave, which has garnered international acclaim for its innovative perspective and meticulous research. In 2018-2019, she was named one of the BBC Radio 3 AHRC New Generation Thinkers, Broadcasters of the Future.
Elsa, welcome to CC.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Hans and Zacharias Janssen built the first simple microscope in 1590, and Robert Hooke and Anthony van Leeuwenhoek later discovered microorganisms using early microscopes, and the germ theory emerged from the work of Robert Koch and Joseph Lister. This led to a fear of diseases such as cholera and typhoid. In your book, Rumbles, you used the examples of London and Paris to describe how excrement was removed from the Thames and the Seine, but more importantly, how uncleanness was increasingly seen as a sign of degeneracy and a threat to social order. And you quote one of my favorite sociologists, Norbert Elias, who observed how the process of civilization led to a growing sense of shame and disgust about bodily waste. Could you help us gain a deeper understanding of how sanitary scientists in the 19th century elevated the gut as an arbiter of technology and medical progress, and how the concept of cleanness later became an integral part of European cultural identity?
It's wonderful to meet a fellow Norbert fan, for one. For another, I think this is a big question. I feel perhaps maybe there are two parts of the answer here. One part is to say the 19th century is the era, the age of public health, right? So it's really the time in which public health as a discipline, as a field, as an approach to disease and illness takes off in a major way. And part of that story is certainly sanitary science. Okay, so sanitary science by the middle of the 19th century is a kind of booming field, and it encompasses a pretty wide range of individual and collective actions and strategies for the improvement of health. So this could be from, improved personal hygiene, right? Washing more, to mass vaccination programs, questions around ventilation in the home, safer food preparation practices, all of these kind of actions and processes aimed at the management and eradication of disease, often with a focus on environment, right? So this recognition that the environment in which you live in can adversely affect your health and can also be a way in which disease is spread. And at the center of this kind of like emerging sanitary science is the question, or rather the problem, of how to dispose of bodily waste in a safe and effective way, right? So there's this awareness, with the emergence of new disciplines like germ theory, that waste, human waste, animal waste, poses a huge threat to health, right? That this was a disease carrying substance. Part of the story here also is about the booming cities. So you mentioned London and Paris. London, throughout the 19th century, becomes more and more and more and more overcrowded as the century progresses, right? This is the age of urbanization. And with that urbanization, with that vastly increased city population, comes new problems with how to manage the extraordinary amount of waste being produced by the humans living in that city. So this is where, technologies, kind of quite humble technologies, like the drain pipe and like the toilet, come to be held up as exemplars of the most impressive medical, scientific thinking of the age. So in the Great Exhibition, right, in the 1850s, there are massive displays of drain pipes. And I mean, there's something wonderfully kind of ticklish about thinking about kind of people going to see the wonders of the world and being shown like a toilet or being shown a drain pipe. But these were at the time seen as absolutely being at the forefront of what it meant to be a scientifically advanced nation. So I think part of the story here is about the necessity, right? An absolute need to figure out what are we going to do about human waste in our kind of growing cities. The second part of the story, I think, is maybe speaks more to Norbert Elias's work, which is what it means culturally and metaphorically to find new ways to deal with waste. And one of the kind of most obvious ways in which our relationship with waste changes in the Western world over the course of the 19th century is the institution of vast sewers. Right, is the institution of these kind of underground sewers in cities like Paris and London. Also added to that, I would say, the movement of industries outside of the city, the movement of abattoirs and places where animals were killed, and also the movement of animals out of the cities and into the countryside more firmly, really starts to reshape and change, what cities look like throughout this period. And I think with the result that the waste products of the body, so the kind of the body's dirtiest, most kind of shame-inducing products, are removed from view, are flushed down the toilet, and then are able to be kind of carried off and dealt with in sewer works. And I think that part of what that does is it radically kind of reshapes a European self of what it means to be civilized or what it means to be an advanced nation. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, this absolutely means to be civilized is to be separated from the waste products of your body. To be uncivilized is to be too closely bound up with them.
Coming back to our gut has its own nervous system, which is often called the second brain. And it has 100 million neurons more than the spinal cord or peripheral nervous system. It uses more than 30 neurotransmitters, just like the brain. This means that there is a huge intelligent exchange between these two nerve centers. And there's more. Bacteria in our gut affect our neurons, emotions, diseases, and even how long we live. They can learn and remember information because they are a site of neural integration and processing. This means our gut is thinking for itself. In the scientific world, how has the discovery that the gut is an autonomous thinker changed the understanding of human intelligence and the concept of intelligence in general.
We are, I think you've pointed to, just captivated by the idea of the thinking belly, right? We love this idea. And I think that part of what that describes, part of what that reveals to us, the thinking belly makes sense to us in a way, right? Because it seems to capture more accurately, I think, how processes of attention, of awareness, of perception necessitate parts of the body other than the brain, right? It makes sense. And I think that part of what this raises, part of what these kind of recent scientific revelations about the extent to which the belly is itself a thinking organ, right? So, neurologists, for example, have been doing this really interesting work tracing the path of the vagus nerve, rather, that runs from brain to bowel, and really discovering kind of just exactly like how much of an influence the gut has in relation to emotional health, but also in relation to all sorts of other kind of cognitive processes. We've also found out scientists who've begun mapping the microbiome have discovered that bacteria living in the intestines seem to help regulate, right, the production of biochemicals, which are themselves responsible for neural growth, right? So there's this kind of interweaving of gut and brain. This all, I think, appeals to us because it feels like common sense in a way, right? For a historian like me, it raises the question of why has intelligence? Why is it that intelligence, at least in the Western world, in a Western context, why has it so long been imagined to be the sole preserve of the brain, right? So when did this idea of the brain as intelligence as brain, come to dominate our thinking? And I guess one place that I looked back to in the book is the work of the famous French philosopher and anatomist René Descartes, who is the first thinker to locate intelligence or what he describes as the soul, firmly in the brain, right? So for him, the brain is everything. The brain is the soul. The body is simply the machine that houses this brain, sometimes described as kind of mechanistic view of the body. And he goes further, right? So in the 17th century, he describes the pineal gland. So the pineal gland, which is this kind of like tiny little gland that sits in the brain and which links the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. He describes this as the seat of intelligence, or the seat of the soul. So not only does he locate intelligence and thinking and cognition in the brain, he also manages to locate it down to this one tiny little gland as being kind of, where we might find the kind of the spark of, what it is to have emotion, what it is to have intelligence, what it is to have a soul, right? What it is to be immortal, in a sense. What is significant about the way in which the long legacy of Descartes, which, in Cartesian dualism, we still live with today, right? The idea that the brain rules the body, let's say, put simply, it has shut off or has kind of closed down a broader imagining of what intelligence might look like. And we can think about that in terms of the way, intelligence might be mapped across the body. So for the ancient Greeks, for example, intelligence was not only a matter of mind, it was also something that was present throughout the body, right? So Galen, for example, thought that the stomach possessed its own intelligence because it was able to register its own emptiness outside of the control of the brain, let's say. So that kind of dispersed intelligence is something that begins to die away in European thinking around the kind of 17th century. And it has a number of effects, right? One, it shuts down the way that we think about what intelligence might be, but it also vastly restricts who is deemed to be or possess intelligence, right? The pineal gland is the property only of humans, okay? And the animal kingdom, those in the animal kingdom don't have it. And what this allows for is this vision of intelligence, or this assertion of intelligence, as something only humans possess. And with that comes an assertion that animals, for example, don't have rights, don't have emotional lives, and therefore don't need to be cared for in the same way as humans do. And I think that part of what I love and what I'm so excited about in relation to this kind of new discovery of the second brain, of the intelligent gut, is the way in which it is, I think, opening our minds much more to different kinds of intelligence and to the way in which intelligence in the animal kingdom might look totally different from what it looks like to us, but should still be valued and that it's still of worth.
And talking about intelligence in animal kingdom and biology, in her book, The Breath of Gaia, cosmologist Jude Corriban talks about a very peculiar experiment with a slime mold. Let's hear how the slime mold's processes arrived at the same solution or conclusion as Japanese engineers and supercomputers after spending long hours in the same project.
For this experiment, researchers specifically used a plasmodial slime mold called Cephalid polycephalic polycephalum, which is a huge single cell with many different nuclei within it. Biologists put the slime mold in the middle of a plate and placed oat flakes around it. The oat flakes were not placed randomly, but rather each of them represented subway stations. The slime moves very intelligently. With its little tendrils, the mold brings its membrane out and absorbs the oat flakes without breaking the membrane of its single cell. After just a couple of hours, these single-celled beings were able to show the most effective routes between all the stations, which, by the way, were Tokyo's subway stations. When they overlaid this process of the molds, they realized it was not just the most effective way of connecting the stations, but it actually replicated the work that Japanese engineers did over a long period of time with the help of supercomputers, the exact same patterns, except of course being inexpensive and faster.
In the next decade, these new scientific advances we have been talking about, intelligence, evolutionary biology, the discovery of a new universe like the gut microbiome, and so on, which give us, as you said, a new perspective on human life that is more about cooperation than domination. What impact will these discoveries or realizations and how we feed ourselves do you think they might have on cultural development?
That's a really great question. I think to come back to what you mentioned about cooperation rather than domination, the environmental historian Melanie Dupuy has made a really interesting argument. So one of the things that she argues in relation to the gut and in relation to the microbiome is that one of the things that this new science or this new mode or method for thinking about the body might allow for is like a reimagining of eating itself, right? So instead of thinking about eating, about consumption as a way of kind of dominating the world, right? So think about kind of humanity treating the world as if it is its kind of breadbasket or grand buffet for us to kind of feast on. So instead of thinking about eating itself as a kind of mode of domination, right? You consume the world in order to dominate and control it. She makes this really interesting argument, which is to say, why do we think about eating in this way? Might eating instead be a form of incorporation, a form of cooperation, a form of collaboration with the microbes in our gut? And I think that for me, that's really kind of important in terms of kind of the way in which something like the science of the gut microbiome might be used to help us rethink and reimagine these kind of long entrenched, very naturalized hierarchies of the body. And in doing so, might help us to kind of reimagine what the world might look like. What she's getting at here is the way in which the body makes us, but also the body makes the world, right? So like the way that we imagine our inner processes has an impact on how we conduct ourselves in the world and has an impact on how we naturalize particular hierarchical structures when maybe another way of thinking about the body might help us to rethink and kind of tear down some of those structures. I think the microbiome itself is super interesting in terms of that, because one of the things that it does is it reveals that we are not, fundamentally not, the kind of upright, rational being that we have been so long told that we are, right? We are not those beings. Instead, we are made up of multiple and multitudinous creatures that are not us. We are a colony. We are multiple. We are creaturely. We are not these kind of rational, upright beings. We are instead much more embedded and entrenched in the environment around us than we've been taught to believe we are. And I think that that realization should make us think very differently about how we conduct ourselves in the world and how we treat the rest of the non-human, more creaturely world.
Yeah, I think it has to do with humbleness and awareness. Of the many aspects you write about the gut, nutrition, health and history, psychology, politics, I found one aspect to be, at least for me, the most intriguing of all. And it is how the gut portrays the most rudimentary of our existence, and at the same time how it can and has been perceived through history as a window to other dimensions, such as emotions and dreams, a space, so to say, of heaven and earth inside our own bodies. Something so physical as chewing food and tearing it with the teeth, swallowing it, digesting it, and expelling it, and at the same time a realm where information could be processed ahead of cognition. It is our belly that first gets hit when something happens that does not feel right. At the same time, it can also give us premonitory feelings about something that might be soon happening. Falling in love or suffering from heartbreak also is felt in the gut. I often wonder, could it be that the soul or the energy of the happening of life resides, as you said, not in the brain but in the gut? And what does the history of philosophy tells us about the link between our emotions and the gut?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer any questions about the soul. That might be slightly outside of my remit. But certainly the gut, again, we tend to elevate the present, that we are the kind of the epoch of new discoveries about the gut. But certainly throughout history, there has been an awareness that there is some connection between the emotional world and the gut, some connection, or some way in which the emotions are tied to or connected to the gut, for sure. So we might think back, to Cheney, who we mentioned before. So this idea that, melancholic feelings are a product somehow of digestion, or either that like digestion might cause melancholic feelings, or that to be melancholic might cause you to have bad digestion, right? So this kind of dual meaning of like to feel something in your gut, that has a kind of double meaning there. I also think that something interesting about the way we come back to intelligence and this idea of a kind of multiple dispersed intelligence, emotions and how we understand, the site of emotions. Those emotions have long been mapped onto the body and onto different bodily parts. So philosophers have been kind of hugely enamored, have not always rather been hugely enamored by the gut. So if someone like, for example, someone like Plato, you're going to think philosophy, let's take it all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So someone like Plato was insistent that the body be split into kind of two distinct regions, right? Two distinct regions which were associated with two different emotional styles. So, for example, he had the head and the heart being associated with what he described as those higher emotions, right? Those higher feelings, courage, honor, brotherliness were really important. And then he splits the body in two. So then you have the lower organs, namely the gut, especially also the liver, which were seen to produce baser appetites and desires, right? So this kind of mapping of the body, which very much associates the gut with unmanly feelings, with lusty feelings, with feelings which are absolutely, with passions rather, perhaps is a better way of putting it, that have to be kept in check by the head and by the heart. So he calls something like anger, for example, he describes that as reason's whip. An emotion like anger should be something that reason can use to keep the kind of the less honorable feelings produced by the gut in check. I think there's this way in which we now think about the gut and maybe gut feelings, right? Pointed to this idea of like intuition, or that, you feel something in your gut first. We now think about the gut as maybe like a kind of marker of authenticity, right? Like to feel something in your gut is to feel an emotion most authentically. What is interesting to me is that through most of history, the gut has not been thought of in those favorable terms, or the gut feelings have not necessarily been held up as something that one should follow or that one should listen to, or that is a kind of authentic emotional experience, but rather as something which is much more linked to our sinful, our kind of baser nature.
In this same regard, acclaimed soloist Andrei Ionita, one of the most admired cellists of his generation, also recognized by many as one of the most exciting cellists to have emerged for a decade, asks you.
Hello, my name is Andrei Ionita, and my question for Dr. Elsa Richardson is, how has our gut feeling, our intuition, been used in music? How has the shift from viewing music as a social utility to creating art for its own sake changed the way we understand its intuitive qualities?
So again, I'm not sure that I can speak to music specifically, but certainly there is an interesting history around creativity, inspiration, and the idea of gut feeling. In my book, I spend a great deal of time with the Romantics, so with poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, who were really committed to this idea of art and poetry and creative expression as being an expression of a kind of authentic self, right? So these poets celebrated madness, for example, as a form of divine inspiration. They were really fascinated by the mysteries of the unconscious. And they certainly, absolutely made space for the idea that some kind of bodily intuition was essential to the production of good art. There was some kind of sense of like creativity as something that is embodied and that's something that sits outside of rationality, right? That's something that kind of escapes the rational brain and occurs elsewhere. There's a really great study by the historian Elizabeth L. Swan about taste and knowledge in early modern England. And in this, Swan points to the way that gustation, right? So the sensation of like consumption, eating, the experience of flavor, let's say, on the tongue, really helped to shape and form culture and creativity in the early modern period. So she writes that throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, there was this relationship between physical and discriminative taste, right? Between having taste, as in like having good aesthetic judgment, but also having taste as in like, being enjoying gustatory pleasures. And Swan points to the way in which like these ways of this kind of processes of digestion, let's say, were in this period really closely intertwined with like how we thought about knowledge and how we thought about creativity, right? So digestion and creativity are like intertwined, two sides of the same coin. However, in the same period, so thinking about, let's say, the 17th and into the 18th century, there's also quite a lot of suspicion leveled at the gut and suspicion leveled at the way in which the gut might not always be an aid to creativity, but might sometimes be an impediment, right? So there's this idea that sometimes digestion and thinking have been set in opposition to one another. So I found this wonderful etiquette guide from the 17th century in which the author was warning that scholars might suffer from bouts of indigestion and also warning them specifically against reading at the table. And this idea that you cannot be thinking, you cannot be reading and processing knowledge in that way while you are processing food and digesting, right? That the gut and the mind are somehow kind of two systems of the body that can't work in harmony with one another. So I think there's two sides of this. And I guess to come back to the Romantics, even though someone like Samuel Taylor Coleridge was, I think, convinced definitely by the idea that the stomach or the body or some kind of like embodied intuition was key to good art making, he was also troubled greatly by indigestion and by gastric distress, which absolutely for him was impeded the work, and instead of writing poems, was writing kind of endless letters to his friends and family, complaining in great detail of, his kind of troubled bowel movements. So I don't know. I think that maybe a bit of an answer that's nothing to do with music, but hopefully gets to something about,
Yeah,
a kind of complicated history of creativity and digestion.
exactly. And I think it's like there's no real determined lines in where to something starts and when does it ends. You can imagine like in the creative process also being very entwined with your own nature and having these gut feelings, and then being overworking that as an ego trip, and then you lose it, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're still, you're making work in context, right? It's not just,
Exactly.
you're not just the kind of lone.
So it's not about you. The creative process is not about you. But if you make it only about you and your own thought about your own personality and so on, then it's lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about this earthly and heavenly duality of the God, I was reminded of my childhood and the very different reaction my parents had to nightmares. Well, for starters, I must clarify that my parents perfectly exemplify the theory that men come from Mars and women come from Venus. Whenever my siblings and I had nightmares as children, my mom would say, "This nightmare, we need to interpret it. What do you think this dream is telling you?" And my dad, in his usual matter-of-fact tone, would just say, "Stop eating such a heavy dinner." So, after later going through a treatment that caused my insulin resistance to play wild and experiencing how food can absolutely cause all kinds of random emotions, I came to realize that my mom might have been right, but that my dad was absolutely spot on. That food does have a direct impact on mental well-being, and that sugar levels when high can absolutely cause terrible nightmares. Could you tell us since when and how the process of digestion and the study of dreams have been linked throughout history in the Western world, and perhaps gives us an example?
Sure. So there is a long-standing connection between the gut, especially, as you point to, the troubled gut, and dreams. So this has a very, very lengthy history. I think perhaps best illustrated by, a lengthy history which actually extends, I think, into the present. So in the 1940s, for example, Webster's dictionary continued to define the nightmare as, and I quote, "a condition brought on in sleep, commonly by digestive or nervous disorders, and characterized by a sense of extreme discomfort or frightful dreams." And recent research, published by the American Journal of Gastroenterology, has explored exactly this relationship between bad bowels and bad dreams. So this is this long-standing connection which suggests that to have a troubled bowels is to have troubled dreams. Part of what is kind of interesting and part of what is fascinating about the history of this is that when we're thinking about this connection between bad bowels and bad dreams, one of the things that it raises is the way in which dreams themselves and the meaning attached to dreams has changed wildly over time. So you pointed to your mother saying, we need to analyze this dream. We need to think about what meanings this dream might have. Now, I'm assuming that your mother probably was working within or thinking about within a broader kind of psychoanalytic culture, right? So this idea that, to analyze the dream is to study its manifest content and from there understand its latent content, right? What are the kind of obvious things the dreams are saying? Let's decode it and get a kind of deeper meaning, a deeper understanding of what is going on in my child's psyche. However, if you were living in medieval England, your mother might instead be asking you kind of, what was in your dream? What images, what symbols did you see? Not to understand better your psyche, but perhaps to understand, is this a prophetic dream, right? Are you prophesizing something that's going to happen? Is this evidence that you are demonically possessed, perhaps? Or is this just a kind of commonplace nightmare, perhaps fueled by an excess of vapors in the belly? So throughout history, and especially in the earlier period, I'm thinking about the medieval period, beyond that, the dream could have multiple and different meanings, right? So a dream might be just simply because you have eaten a heavy meal, let's say, as your father accuses you of doing, and that heavy meal is fermenting in the gut overnight, and that fermentation is causing vapors to rise up from your stomach and into your brain, and that is what's causing your nightmare. Or it might be that, complicatedly, it might be that although that seems like the natural explanation, it might be that actually you are demonically possessed and a demon has entered your stomach and caused those vapors to arise from your stomach and give you the nightmare. So there's this way in which what is fascinating to me about this connection between the gut and the dream and the nightmare is that it brings to light the way in which psychological, supernatural, natural understandings of the brain and the belly are not always completely distinguishable from one another, right? That they often kind of can coexist alongside.
Talking about coexistence of these two different natures. For my final question, I would like to turn our attention to surrealist food and art. And who better to do so than one of the last survivors of the surrealist movement of the 1930s, Leonora Carrington, a British-born naturalized Mexican surrealist painter and novelist, founder-member of the women's liberation movement in Mexico in 1970s. In Carrington's stories and paintings, food and animals and the gods take on an identity that only dreams can give. In her narratives, the body is frequently depicted as a site of culinary alchemy, a metaphorical kitchen where manipulation occurs. The outcome is a world characterized by consumption, excess, the supernatural, and perversion. Let's hear an excerpt of Carrington's short story, The Sisters.
In the kitchen, cakes and enormous tarts were put to the flame and taken from the oven. Pomegranates and melons, stuffed with larks, filled the kitchen. Whole oxen were turning slowly on spits. Pheasants, peacocks, and turkeys awaited their turn to be cooked. Chests full of fantastic fruit cluttered up the corridors. Drazil walked about slowly in this forest of food, tasting a lark or a cake here and there. In the cellars, the old wooden casks gave up their contents of blood, honey, and wine. Most of the servants were lying about the floor, dead drunk. Drazil took the opportunity to hide a demijohn of honey under her skirt. She went up to the attic. The top of the house was engulfed in a deep silence. Rats and bats peopled the spiral staircases. Drazil arrived finally before a door, which she opened with a large key attached to a chain around her neck. "Juniper?" she said. "Are you there?" "As usual," answered a voice out of the gloom. "I don't move." "I've brought you something to eat. Are you better today?" "My health is always excellent, sister." "You're ill," replied Drazil in an irritated voice. "What have you brought me to eat?" she asked, jumping on her perch. The moment she saw the creature moving, Drazil slammed the door behind her. But Juniper had eyes for nothing but the honey. "You've got to make it last at least 6 days," Drazil said. Juniper ate for some time in silence.
My stomach is society, once said Leonora Carrington. What do you think, Dr. Elsa Richardson, that she meant by this?
Well, I think there's probably several ways to interpret this remarkable statement, my stomach, the society. But I think on the one hand, I think it's definitely connected to her surrealist cooking experiments, or as we just heard, the surrealist weight of food in her fiction. I think also there's a way, if you were to read this biographically, that we could think about this as an interpretation. We could think of this as a kind of expression, let's say, of the mental health crisis that she suffers after Max Ernst is interned in a French prison camp for the second time. But I think in relation to my own work, it makes me think about the permeability of the gut. It makes me think about the ways in which the gastrointestinal tract, right? This kind of, to be human is to be strung out across, two sides of a belly. The way in which the gastrointestinal tract is where the outside world whistles in, how the outside world gets in to the kind of inner sanctum of the body. So there is sociability in cooking and eating, but there's also something, and this is what I think Carrington is getting at a little bit here, there's also something deeply ontologically shuddering about eating, right? Because eating is, in a really basic way, how we go about transforming the outer world into the inner world, right? It's about how we shift something from being not us, profoundly not us, into something which is of us. And I think that what she's getting at here, My Stomach with Society, is pointing to how glorious that is, but also how deeply weird and troubling and soul-shaking to eat is.
I think you put it brilliantly. Elsa, this has been a fantastic journey through the history of the gut. Thank you for your precious time and an amazing, fun, and intelligent interview.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real joy.
Thank you to our listeners wherever you are for having allowed us to share time with you. Please do not forget to check this episode's description to learn about Dr. Elsa Richardson's work and how you can contact her. And don't miss Rumbles, A Curious History of the Gut, a book that will be your path to a lively tour of all the ways we try to make sense of this enigmatic and fascinating organ that rumbles our daily life. Thank you. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.